I'm Liz Felix, and we're live and direct from home on WYEP. I've got a special guest today. His debut record came out 45 years ago this year, and he's just released his 32nd album. This one's with the Imposters. It's called The Boy Named If. I've got Elvis Costello here on WYEP. Thank you for joining me today.
Hello, it's good to hear you. Good to hear you.
It's good to hear you too. And I want to first ask you what your experience has been like over the last 2 years. Obviously, a very weird period of time for everybody. But from what I understand, this album was created essentially with everyone in separate places. So you have everyone recording their parts wherever they are, piecing them together. And I'm just wondering, what has this experience been like for you personally and also from a professional perspective in making this new album?
Well, it sounds when you describe it like it should be really inhibited and tentative, but I think a cursory listen to this record will suggest rather a different reality. And I think you mentioned 45 years. That is also the 45 years that I've been playing with Pete Thomas and Steve Naive on and off, not for the whole of that time, but they've been involved in nearly all of the records that I've made in some way. We spent a lot of time in a band together in the 70s and 80s, the Attractions, and 20 years ago, Davey Farragher, who I think after 20 years has deserved the respect of not being anybody's replacement, but actually a vital member of this band, which has its own personality. We've played more concerts than we have made records under the name of Elvis Costello and the Imposters. The band has always been involved. I have made other records, as you may know, in the last 20 years of a number of different kinds. When you come back to pick up the electric guitar again, as I did in the summer of 2020, just having a guitar in my hands again just seemed to drag the words out of me very rapidly. And they were all, suddenly these songs were all there, and I don't know where they came from. But they must have been thinking about a number of connected things. I never write the word, two words I never use referring to my own work is concept and genre. I just don't use those words. I mean, there's perfectly good, serviceable words that don't sound so pompous. So I suddenly realized that the best way to do this was immediately, and I wasn't prepared to wait until we could be in the room together. And if you think about it for just a moment, going into the studio is often a process of separating musicians willfully into boxes, into sound booths. You're not staring at each other eye to eye when you're playing very often. Even if you make a record all of one performance with everybody, it's not uncommon to go in and fix a word that you mumbled or add a second guitar or a harmony. So those are all an accumulation of separate moments that the producer or the mixer has to pull together into the final record that you press. I don't really see the difference of doing it in different locations. I've made records that have the rhythm sections have been recorded in one town and the vocal in another in the past. Of course, proximity and location can really influence a record. And I think it did here. Frankly, I think the fact that we didn't have to look at each other's ugly faces really helped us lose our inhibitions. We weren't
Yeah, I mean, it's
distracted by any kind of gruesome gurning.
right. Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting that you say, because I think sometimes people who don't necessarily know a ton about how records are made, like
Uh,
especially me when I was younger, I always thought, oh, they all get together in a big room and, they all just play together like they do at a live show, but it's really recording is not like that at
no,
all.
in fact,
So,
even records that sound very spontaneous, you often find are the product of very meticulous editing. And I'm talking about records on an incredibly high level, records by Miles Davis, records by the Beatles, that were recently seen in Get Back, the process of the
yeah.
Beatles trying to sit very close together and get the feeling that they had maybe when they were began as teenagers. But that's them concluding a process that they had been through, which involved playing in front of people where they couldn't hear themselves, to going into the studio and making a very complex record like Sgt. Pepper, and then after that, re-emerging and trying to reclaim something of that spontaneity of playing in a rehearsal room, really, which is what you mostly see them doing, rehearsing and
Yeah.
sort of stumbling, sometimes quite comically, towards songs that are now so indelible to us. Something in the way she moves attracts me like a pomegranate. Really? You know, that George Harrison actually thought for a moment that might be the line. Is of course very funny when you see it happen. But if you hadn't written that song already, you could think of any number of words that could complete that phrase, you know.
Yeah, it was really interesting to watch them write lyrics together, and you don't realize like how kind of silly that process is, you
It's,
know?
you have to listen. A lot of making rock and roll in every way, the playing and the singing and the writing, is like running around in your underwear. You know, it's you have to lose your embarrassment. Some noises that you make might sound completely ungainly and undignified, and then you hear them back in the context of the song. They sound just great.
Yeah.
You're opening your head and letting something out. You know, like the alien.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Get Back because you know, that was the band that really introduced me. I guess not introduced me, but it's a band that's been with me my entire life.
Mhm.
And so it's probably why I'm doing what I do. And so to
Me
go back
too.
and see, yeah, and I'm sure that's so true for so many musicians, but to go back and watch that and get that glimpse was just so mind-blowing to me. And I felt like, especially watching Paul McCartney and Get Back was really incredible. And I walked away from that. I already appreciated Paul McCartney, but I walked away just feeling like, what an incredible songwriter. And you've had the opportunity to write with him.
I did. I wrote 15 songs with him in about 1988, 89. And I had some of that magical experience of just sitting across from him, being as I am left-handed also, but play right-handed. I think something he commented on them, you know, in his writing with John Lennon, is they were like a mirror image. So as you're looking, you know, I couldn't possibly imagine myself in the place of John Lennon and writing with him. Never presumed to have that. They had a transition out of teenage years and into the like an unrepeatable experience of the kind of fame they had. It's just never going to be like that again, because everything about our world now is so interconnected. You could simply never spring the surprise at that level. You can quote numbers of sales. It doesn't matter. It's nothing like it. I think the experience of being something like the Beatles or even Elvis Presley before them can only be compared to the level of fame of Charlie Chaplin, you know, in the days of his films,
Mm-hmm.
or the astronauts that went to the moon. It's like a singular
Right.
experience, really, in
Yes.
our age. So sitting with Paul, you know, and now I'm all grown up. I'm not a 9, 10-year-old member of the Beatles fan club. I'm 30 odd, you know, and I've written a lot of songs myself. And he presumably hasn't asked me to come and write with him so I can tell him how great I thought Love Me Do was, you know. And we got to work, and it was, I don't think either of us wanted to face a blank page. So we both came in with a partly finished song. And in learning how to complete each other's thoughts in those two songs, we freed ourselves to write very, very swiftly, another 3 or 4 on each occasion that we got together. And I couldn't think of anything more fun than going downstairs from his writing room the moment a song was finished into the recording studio and putting the song down with 2 guitars. Those are still by far the best versions of those tunes, you know, because they were so unself-conscious, you know.
How incredible. I mean, what an incredible experience.
Mind-bending, yeah.
But there's so many people that you've collaborated with, you know, and you mentioned not using the word genre, but I mean, across genres, it's like you've got
Just did
Helen
it anyway.
Toussaint and
Despite my
Lucinda
advice to the
Williams and all these
I just
people,
say
you know.
style, form. You know, there are different forms of music, clearly. There are different techniques of music. There are different disciplines of music. There are different ways to communicate, particularly with musicians. And that's one of the things that adventure that I've been fortunate enough to have is that in becoming curious about forms of music other than the ones that I began in, meant that I had to gather a few skills along the way. Because I didn't get to go to college, I didn't go to university, I left school at 18. I had no formal musical education. So everything I absorbed was, you know, by listening and by
Mhm.
example and trying to copy things and probably failing to copy them well and accidentally inventing something of my own. And then I got interested in forms of music that I definitely couldn't play. Like I couldn't be in a string quartet. But I became very fascinated by string quartet music, and I became friends with the Brodsky Quartet, and I had to learn to write music in order to clearly communicate with them. I mean, when I say write music, I could imagine it, but literally write it down accurately. So I got over my inhibition about learning that code. And when I need it, I've got that skill now. I don't do it for every song I write because I don't need to. But
Right.
if I want to work with an orchestra, I can write my own orchestration and I'm satisfied with the results. If I wanted to hear a more sophisticated, more learned orchestration, I'd know who to call, but that wouldn't necessarily be what I wanted. It's a bit like the pictures I draw for the artwork. I know they're not uh, Michelangelo. Nobody needs to tell me that. I have eyes too, but they are my own dreams and nightmares and jokes. They're cartoons, they're only cartoons, and it's not something to get upset about.
I think this album is really imaginative. I mean, your albums often are, but there's so many characters on this release. And you talked a little bit earlier about, having these kind of all out rock songs on this album,
Mhm.
but there's other stuff going on there too. I mean, there's a ballad in the middle of the album. And I guess, really struck. I'm always fascinated when songwriters do this. They take a really upbeat, sort of fun sounding song, but then you stop and listen to the lyrics, and it's like, oh my gosh, like there's really some some deeper, darker things going on here. Is that something that you find you do often in your songwriting, or did you intentionally do that? Is that just how it came out?
Well, there's all sorts of different reasons why you might employ that. Sometimes you might take a very serious theme, say, for instance, referring back to Paul McCartney and our writing together, the very first song we ever completed together was Veronica, which, I had written a good part of before I took it to that session. Now, that song's about my grandmother's Alzheimer's and that strange moment just before it becomes utterly terrifying for the person entering into dementia. There's almost a crazy sort of humor in the very, very first experience of it because there's an awareness of losing certain ties to logic and continuity that is, people sometimes cover it with humor. So I try to capture just that joyful moment where I glimpsed this right before she plunged into really something that could only be expressed with sadness. And that's why that melody is a very bright, it's almost like a whistling past the graveyard kind of attitude.
Right.
Bright music to express something quite sad, very sad. And I've kept that technique in reserve. Don't use it all the time because it would seem like you were just being perverse or you simply couldn't find the more emotional music for your subject matter. So a song like um, "Paint the Red Rose Blue," which is the ballad I think you're referring to,
Yes.
is about someone who has courted theatrical darkness. It actually refers to that. Somebody who has always embraced the mystery and the intrigue of a kind of theatrical, dark persona, and then into life comes a terrible, it's an unspecified sorrow, but it's something very profound that causes a moment of doubt between a husband and wife. And I just wrote it out as if it were like a Grimm's fairy tale, really, with roses changing color, not because they were those colors were anything to do with allegiance or a flag or a banner, but because red is often associated with romance and blue with melancholy. That's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Like a lot of fairy tales have very simple symbolism for something very terrible. Many of the older fairy tales are dealing with infant mortality, for instance, and they're just different transpositions. A lot of H.C. Andersen's stories are to do with the repression of desire because in his society, in his era, expressing carnal love always had to be cloaked in kind of romantic love. So he was obsessed with a very famous opera singer and wrote the Red Shoes and all these very, very brutal stories about his love for this woman. But they've become world famous children's stories in their sort of slightly bowdlerized versions.
I mean, it's
Um,
interesting. Like the subtitle of the album, it's called "The Boy Named If and Other Children's Tales," and I think some people maybe on the surface have interpreted that to mean, well, because there are songs on this album that deal with the themes of coming of age and
yeah.
what the difference is between being a child and then suddenly becoming aware of what the world is really like. I think people have maybe thought, oh, this is a concept album about that. but after you
It's,
kind of
I
deeply
mean,
listen to
again,
it, it's
that's
not.
another one of those words. Concept, yes, is another word for ideas. And there's, concept album has come associated with a particular form of very preconceived notions, like we're going to venture off into the topographic oceans or to the dark side of the moon. But that seems to me to have a blueprint in advance. And I don't have a blueprint in advance. I have a lot of ideas. And the thing that I find I have to do as a songwriter is recognize when certain types of ideas belong together in a group of songs and make an album. So, yes, there's the theme of In the Boy Named If, of this charming invention of an imaginary friend that a 7-year-old can use to explain why they broke a cup is less endearing when it's a 37-year-old saying, well, that's why I stayed out all night because somebody made me do it, and it's obviously just an alibi. So I try to catch in The Death of Magic Thinking this feeling, which I have a very strong memory of leaving behind wonder and imagination and daring and unself-consciousness for the years in between childhood and adulthood that some people never leave, where you're suddenly bound by a feeling of unworthiness, of desire for things you don't know whether you're supposed to want, and the study of subjects that's at school which seem entirely obscure to your happiness. Like algebra is a useful way of expressing certain concepts, but at a certain age, it's like, why are they doing this to me? It's just a kind of torture,
Yeah, I remember
an
that.
unreasonable torture. So I try to catch this. I mean, and I don't. I tried to on a few times focus on a very small detail that represented this. Um, in The Death of Magic Thinking, the chorus is about this very um, really upsetting moment, but it's not a moment about abuse. It's about a slightly older girl who knows something about sex that the boy doesn't know, and she dares him to put his hand on her leg under her skirt. But it isn't a seduction. She's teasing him because she knows something he doesn't know, and in that moment she has power over him. And it only lasts for a split second, but it's not a judgment on either of them. It's a moment of relative innocence that happens right before you, of course, discover what all of those caresses and overtures and responses are supposed to mean, and where the line of responsibility lies, and what you're permitted, and how you have to be invited. These are all things you have to learn. But
Mhm.
I didn't think that moment, I'd never found that moment in a song prior to this, so that's why I put it there. The
Yeah.
difference is, I suppose, the reverse. It's a boy trying to seduce a girl who, sadly, knows only too well what these things mean because she has had to fend off the advances of her own father. Now that's a very painful subject to put in a song. So I didn't want to make it melodramatic. I wanted to have it as the conclusion of the verse, where everything else seemed like a dance of, they're in a dance together. And do you know right from wrong? He thinks he's leading her down a path into some magical world, and he doesn't realize she's already knows how lacking in magic all of that is. So, maybe that is a little dark, and there are other times in life that I've tried to catch in other tales on the record. You notice that. And that's why I called it children's stories, because they have some of their origins in children's experiences, but it's the consequences of what comes next.
That's really interesting. It's interesting, the connection between those two songs on the album. Um, I want to ask you about something that's maybe a little bit old news, but about a decade ago, you hosted an interview show and a music show called Spectacle. And I remember watching that. And I think it was specifically watching you interview Smokey Robinson. And I just thought, wow, so here's a person who has been interviewed so many times, and has had so many experiences, good or bad, with interviewers. And now the tables have turned and you're talking to Smokey Robinson.
Yeah, yeah.
Did that experience of interviewing other musicians give you any insight into the interview process, or change how you thought about it in any way?
I think it was more the reverse, and I was very awkward with it at first. Of course, I didn't know what to do with my hands, and don't sort of talk over the get all these things that you have to learn technically, which I had no training in. But I did notice quite quickly, I think about 4 shows in, I interviewed Lou Reed, who was famously very difficult to interview.
Yes.
I had several writer friends who said, I don't know how you did that. I said, well, I can only guess that it was, I knew Lou a little bit, but I wouldn't say we were close friends. We didn't spend a lot of time together. He was always, particularly in later years, very, very affectionate and warm to me whenever we met. And he knew that I appreciated music that he appreciated, and he did appreciate a lot of music that wasn't apparent from listening to his own recordings. Something in all of that seemed to put him at some kind of ease for him to be more revealing than in many other interviews where he was much more guarded. And I really carried that over into the other interviews and tried to calm myself. Sometimes I would just get overexcited because I was genuinely such a fan of the people. I was so lucky to do 20 of these shows, and I can't say there were any of them that I wasn't genuinely curious about what the people had to say. If I'd had a full-time television show for 5 years, maybe I would have ended up talking to somebody in whom I only had a contrived interest, because I had to fill a space in a schedule. But I could honestly say I was really curious to know what the people had to say. And I also have to say that much of the best material didn't get into the shows because I was somebody like Herbie Hancock. I always wanted to talk to him about the score of Blow Up, and I mean, it's a little hard to explain that to the television audience.
Yeah.
Tell me about working with Antonio. But no, they need to hear about Rocket, and Watermelon Man. You've got to put the pieces in that bring the audience into the tent, and then you hope that you're going to get some other little pieces. I think we did mention Antonio a little bit, but I mean, there were lots. Bruce Springsteen was incredible. I mean, we talked for 2 hours, and we were talking about shared experiences of going to Catholic school, or very contrasting experiences of going to Catholic school, and playing in bar bands, which he did much more than I did. And I realized after 2 hours we were still in the Jersey bars, and he hadn't made Born to Run yet. So I had to ask him while they kind of, found some more tape. Will you stay a bit longer? Because I can't make the show and not mention all your hit records, And he was good enough to stay for another 2 hours. We did 4 hours at the Apollo.
Oh, wow.
It's like a very long E Street Band show, or even a Grateful Dead show.
Right.
And he was so generous, And I have to imagine that was not to do with my amazing skills as a conversationalist so much as maybe a level of comfort, because however different each of the artists were, I have next to no resemblance to the music that was sung by Tony Bennett or Renee Fleming, the opera singer. But we all go onto the stage with words and music with the intention of telling some sort of story. That commonality was enough to give us something where we had trust in each other, which is different to another kind of writer who's an interpretive writer at best. A journalist is at best an interpretive writer. A critic is at best somebody with some knowledge of music. Sadly, standards have dropped, and quite a lot of people literally don't know what they're talking about. They're using words that actually mean other things, particularly when they try to use musical terms and speak in French. It's like that's just the truth. I'm just speaking the truth as I speak it. I'm not having a go at you, but because you said genre, but
no.
It is just true. People will use musical terms to try and make themselves look informed, and they are literally saying the wrong words for what they're trying to say.
Little different when it's two musicians talking.
Yeah, you also don't want to, what do they call that phrase, inside baseball? You don't want to get what that is. I don't even understand how baseball works, but it's like cricket for people in knickerbockers, But I mean, I really have to believe that's the case, and I think that was really true when we had more than one singer on the stage at the same time. We had one very lovely moment where there was a beautiful singer from Memphis called Jesse Winchester, who spent a lot of time in Montreal during the Vietnam War. He was a conscientious objector and went over the border, and he was pardoned by Jimmy Carter. He came back and lived and he passed a few years ago. He sang a song that was so beautiful. It was a really beautiful song that he sang, that Nico Case, who was sitting next to him in this panel of songwriters, was in tears. I could barely speak. We, all of us, were so amazed by the beauty of this song. that was worth everything. That communicated more than any question that I could have asked him. He'd explained it all already just by singing.
Elvis Costello, thank you so much for joining me today. I mean, I wish I could keep you here for 2 hours and ask you
Anytime you
questions.
like, I'll
Such a
come and I'll
fan.
visit you when we can, and we'll have
We'd
to
love
come
to
back.
have you here in Pittsburgh.
We owe a show to Pittsburgh. I know that. The last time we had that, we had a terrible struggle with the sound, and we came off the stage saying, "Wow, that felt like a great show," and nobody heard it. We had some technical issues, and I think we've resolved those now. And I know you've got some great venues.
We
Pittsburgh's a
do.
place where you play down by the railroad tracks.
Oh,
Isn't there a venue in Pittsburgh where you have a railroad track runs behind the
I'm not
band?
sure.
I think you
I don't know.
do.
I'm
An
fairly new
outdoor
here,
venue.
so there
Mhm.
could be something that I don't know about. But
Oh, I remember
well,
I managed to get the train into the song. And then my wife played there a week
ah,
about 2 weeks later, and it did the same thing happen. She got to take the A train into her set. I got Mystery Train into my set, I think.
I'll have to do some research on that.
You
Well,
will.
thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you gave us here at WYEP. The new record is called The Boy Named If, and Elvis Costello has been my guest today on 91.3 WYEP.
Until the next time, thank you very much.